Hello, and welcome back to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast. Jeanne Allert, Executive Director of the Samaritan Women, based in Baltimore, Maryland, will be sharing with us today about serving, growing, and supporting a team, even in the face of subtle resistance. And on another note, if you're interested in learning more about becoming a person of influence and better serving your nonprofit or ministry, please join me on a free webinar on the topic on June 23rd. Visit nonprofitleaders.network.com/influence to learn more and get registered.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, where your host, KIRSTEN BULLOCK, interviews nonprofit CEOs and executive directors to share what's working. This podcast is produced every 2 weeks, and show notes are found at www.nonprofitleadersnetwork.com. Come back often, and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Any links we talk about will be listed in the show notes. Now, let's get on with the show.
I had the privilege of meeting Jeanne in Louisville several weeks ago at a nonprofit training out at Southeast Christian. When I heard a little bit about her story, I knew she'd have great information to share with you. Jeanne has a long history of entrepreneurial initiatives. Her professional background includes technical consulting in the intelligence community, distance learning, and internet consulting for nonprofits. She founded the Samaritan Women in 2007 in response to a spiritual calling to reach out to young women who have been exploited through domestic sex trafficking. She's the chief architect behind the Samaritan Women's restorative care model and today serves as executive director for this national ministry. Jeanne, could you share with us a little bit more about the Samaritan Women to give our listeners some context for size of the organization and the types of challenges you might be dealing with day to day?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Our organization is a national organization. While we're headquartered on the East Coast in Maryland, we do serve survivor referrals from across the country. That's by intention. When we were established, we planned on being a national organization because the nature of the problem we attend to is one of national consequence, and this crime is not geographically constrained. And so because victims are taken all over the United States and abroad, we can't necessarily just plant in one area and have that be our service population. So one of the big challenges we have is to make sure that referring agencies, law enforcement at the federal or state level, or social service agencies who may encounter a victim of trafficking knows about us. And so national communications is really important. Networking on that scale is really important. But that's also challenged by the fact that our whole country is at a place where we're just learning about this issue as a domestic problem. And so it's not on the tip of everyone's tongue. And so identifying the communication channels for letting people know that your service is available is one of the big challenges that we have.
And I would imagine a lot of our nonprofits listening would see themselves as identifying with this challenge. A lot of them see themselves as being the best kept secret in town. So definitely figuring out how to identify those challenges and get the word out would be something that people will definitely resonate with.
Well, which makes a big part of my responsibility to network with people who are in my same chair, but elsewhere across the country, and to try to find them. I think the other thing that makes for an interesting challenge for us is that some of the agencies who do this work are pretty under the radar on purpose for security reasons. So finding one another is a harder proposition than you might imagine.
I could definitely see that. But definitely those networks would make your ability to do your work a lot easier, as you said.
Mm-hmm. There also aren't professional conferences or degree programs or anything for the issue of human trafficking. I mean, that's starting. We're beginning. In fact, we're hosting a national conference this year, but it's just beginning that people are coming together to have shared dialogue. And so I anticipate that over the next 3 years, that landscape will change radically.
Mm-hmm. So if any of our listeners are representing organizations that are dealing with this issue from one angle or another, should they go ahead and reach out to you to help make that connection?
Oh, absolutely. We'd welcome it.
Okay, great. And what is your web address? I didn't mention it at the beginning.
Sure. It's www.thesamaritanwomen, and it's plural, .org.
Great, thanks. Since you founded the organization, you've experienced some tremendous growth. What would you say that growth has been most attributed to?
Fearlessness, I think, is probably the most summative word. Just believing in the call of what we are to do and not being dissuaded by how impractical it is, how expensive it is, how unchartered the waters may be. I don't want to overstate our position, but I think the people who do what I do across the country all feel a sense of independent pioneer, and we do sort of feel like we're out there by ourselves, as I've established, because we don't often know who else is out there, but also because there isn't a strong foundation for this kind of work. We have to borrow a lot from other fields like domestic violence and child abuse and foster care and intimate partner violence and law enforcement, trauma-informed care, but there isn't much of a pure play. And so when you don't have a lot of knowns, you have to be comfortable in the unknown, and you have to just keep going. I think our growth has been completely attributed, to God's blessing on the work that we do. But I also want to recognize that we're filling an important void. And people are always asking us to sometimes even grow at a more accelerated rate than we're prepared to do.
I would imagine. So how have you managed that growth to make it something where the organization has time to adjust to the new size? I'm not going to say that I've got that 100% right now. There is a lot that I lean on the staff and try to assess their stability. We use a lot of metaphors around here, and sometimes it feels like we are in a firehouse, and we do a lot of training. We try to put our tools together and make sure that we know how to handle it, but every fire is different, and you never know how they're going to end. And so every woman who crosses our path has presented somehow in a nuance or in a radical way some new challenge we weren't prepared for. And so it's hard in the work, in the human services field to ever say, I got this. I finally figured out humans. No, that'd be crazy. And so it's difficult. When you're creating a product, you can more readily say, yes, I've now got consistency in that product. With a service, and particularly for human services, it's much harder to say that you now have a command of what you do. So, like I say, I'm always leaning on the staff to see when they are conveying a sense of confidence and stability and consistency in what we're doing. And then that feels like that plateau is the foundation for new growth. Mm-hmm. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you have to say no to helping somebody?
Oh, a lot. We probably get, I would say, maybe 6 to 8 referrals a month, and we might take 1 or 2. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Some of them are just our program limitations. Some of them are the referral candidates themselves are just not really ready. They're just sort of fishing for what's possible. Sometimes it's just a bad fit. So it's difficult. I think what's harder on staff is when we do accept a survivor and we find that she, in the long run, is not going to be able to prevail in the program. And that's emotionally taxing.
I would imagine, especially for staff when they've invested so personally
Truly.
in someone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so how do you keep the staff upbeat and positive with that? Do you have specific things that you do, or is it just a sense of community and camaraderie?
Well, but you can't have that unless you're intentional about it, right? Community
right.
requires some specific investments from leadership. And I tend to be a AAA personality, so the nurturing of staff is not my strong suit. So one of the things that I do is I make sure that I have staff who are very good at nurturing each other. It's an important management realization. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And so I'm not the person who walks around and says, how was your kid's birthday? Or remembering, oh, you've been here 3 years. Oh, yeah, happy anniversary, you forgot. That unfortunately tends to be me, but I make sure that I have staff who attend to those things. We try to do a lot of celebration and celebrating the little things. So, for example, when our survivors have some small triumph, she wrote to her mother for the first time after 7 years. We try to celebrate that. We try to stop and recognize it. We pray together. We don't celebrate in the sense that we're all going bowling or going onto a picnic or something like that, but we try to capture the moment and share it as a reminder of why we're here and what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And so what would it be an example of that kind of mini celebration?
This is going to sound a little strange, I think, but we had a survivor who came in and she didn't speak for the first 3 months, and she always wore long shirts and covered herself with her hair and hoodies, and she was really sort of going out of her way to try to be invisible. And fast forward about 8 months, and she has grown significantly in her relationships and confidence. And she showed up in the office in a short sleeve shirt. And hard to convey the picture, but you have to imagine that from her shoulders down to her wrists, she was just full of cut marks, where just years and years of self-abuse. And it was a little horrific to see at first, but what we had to do, you gasp sort of at first, you're going to hold it together and go, okay, that's a moment. But then we had to turn around and we had to celebrate that, because she now feels so confident and so secure that she can be that liberated with us. And so that's a celebration for us, right? Look how far she's come. And so we have to pause on those moments and say, let's look at this on a deeper level and see this is a measure of progress for her. And she's now participating in, quote unquote, normal life in a way that she didn't 8 months ago. So that was a big celebration.
Right. And I'll bet it's stories like that that really keep you going.
There are many. Yeah, there are many. But they tell a little differently than, like, oh, she got a key to her new apartment, and I mean, those are real easy stories to tell, because they're, we just completed 2 graduations, and those were public and, just a traditional celebration, but we also have to measure the small things along the way, the small steps.
Mm-hmm. And your celebration in that instance was reflecting on it as staff members and encouraging each other that, yes, this was a great moment.
Yeah, this was a big deal. This was a big deal. Mm-hmm.
So going back to that growth that you've experienced over the last several years, I'm guessing that there's been a few points of learning experiences. Some people might call them failures. I prefer learning experiences. Over the years. Are there any that you might feel comfortable sharing with us?
It has been a really hard road. And I would think 2 that have been the most troubling, but they all fall under the same heading, resistance, external resistance. In a faith-based context, you might say, spiritual attacks. But when you're working particularly on a justice initiative, a social justice initiative, not everybody agrees with what you're doing. We can all kind of get behind the idea that people should have clean water, and there aren't a whole lot of people that disagree that that's important. But the field that we're in is one of those issues where there are a lot of people who stand to gain economically from this business thriving. And they're not going to necessarily be the people who are going to come right out front and say, no, I think, trafficking of a child is a good idea. It's not going to be an overt resistance or challenge. It's going to be very subversive. And so I think that's been hard for us because we haven't been able to see where the resistance isn't coming and meeting us face to face. It's passive, it's subtle, it's insidious, and it's hard to fight that kind of attack. Why wouldn't people want human beings to live a free and unoppressed life? But yet there is a tremendous machine. This wouldn't be tens of billions of dollar industry if there weren't people who wanted it to proliferate. So I know that's kind of abstract. It's not really a specific lesson, but I'll take it down to a specific level. It's hard. For example, we try to work through the church. It's very hard to talk about some of these issues within the walls of the church. Some churches don't want to talk about sexual sin. Some churches don't have a platform for being able to talk about those issues, or it's not a part of their congregational culture to call out our own sin. There was a study that was done about men who buy commercial sex, and the study yielded that of the sampling of buyers, 53% of them claimed a church affiliation. So if we extrapolate that and just say, okay, there are men within the church who are paying for sex, and our ladies may well be the victims of those buyers, then we have to attend to this issue within the church. And it's a real challenge to get that message across, because it would be so much easier to just cup our ears and close our eyes and la that away and say, we don't want to deal with that. We don't want to be that honest. So that's a tough one.
So how have you addressed that? Have you been able to work through that with a congregation and start talking about it more? We have to keep raising the issue, whether it's comfortable or not, and then wait for the right door to open. There have been some congregations who are willing to say, yeah, we've got a problem, or yeah, we realize this is a social issue. Interestingly enough, those congregations that have had some internal challenge, like maybe there's been some scandal or something like that within their own congregation, are the ones who tend to be much more honest about how real this problem can be for all of us, for any of us. And so working through those churches who are ready because they've been broken in their own way. And so using them as a channel for making it okay to talk about some of these issues. And working through the youth, because oddly enough, the youth are much more courageous. They're bombarded with this stuff all the time. And so we find that our young adults are much more receptive to the message and to what needs to be done about it. And so for those congregations who aren't quite ready to hear that yet, I imagine you stay in touch with them, maybe share additional information occasionally.
Absolutely. And there's ways for congregations to get involved in this issue that don't have to be, full hands in the dirt, if you know what I mean by that. That they can support the work of survivor care. We use a lot of congregations for volunteers within our organization. You can do the happy stuff. You can pick a survivor up and take her out for car shopping or driver's ed or to an appointment. And those are things that are pleasant and valuable, important to do. So not everybody has to engage in attacking the issue from a systemic perspective. We can be proactive and reactive, and the church needs to be on both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm. And so you meet people where they're at and provide plenty of opportunities along the spectrum to get involved in a way they feel comfortable.
Absolutely.
Great. Now, if you were starting this organization all over again, is there anything that you would do differently?
You know, it's funny because I mentioned fearlessness in the to your last question, but if I could have been even more fearless, and particularly about the seasons when I had to do this all by myself, I think that's when I had my greatest panic and probably made some of my worst decisions, is when I focused too much on the fact that for a while I was a lone ranger. And if you close your eyes and you sort of picture the person who's sort of walking out into the desert by themselves, with that kind of feeling of helplessness, that's sort of the desert that it was feeling like at times, not all the time. But I think during those seasons of the founding years, when there were times when I was making the decision all by myself, or I had to come up with the solution all by myself, I hadn't yet built up a network of people I could lean on. Our board was just forming, and there was a lot of times when I'm, on my knees going, I'm all by myself here, God. I know you're with me, but like right now I'm feeling really alone. That when I didn't navigate that well, I think I didn't hire perhaps as well as I could have had I had more confidence. And I was happy to have a warm body. Like, oh my gosh, somebody walks through the door, they're a live one, and so you're just happy to have the help. But in that enthusiasm, I think I lost some discernment, and didn't necessarily say, yes, but who's coming through the door? Is it a lamb or is it a wolf? And so I say that was rooted in just being afraid of the times that leaders have to be alone. And now looking back, I know that it's an important part of leadership, is that there are times when it is just you. As they say, the buck stops here. Mm-hmm. And being okay with that.
And when you were in those times, did you ever have moments where people were attacking you or the ministry that were particularly tough to walk through alone?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've gotten horrendous personal attacks, groups that have made accusations about us that were completely false, but gossip loves an ear. And,
it does.
Oh my goodness. And just to be able to watch, a single match creating a forest fire. And then you're standing there by yourself just going, I have no idea how I'm going to get this fire under control, because it seems like it's completely out of control. So criticisms about how we were doing, what we were doing, my leadership of what we were doing. And I think for me, what was really tough to wrestle with was, I'm happy to take criticism from somebody that I deem credible, somebody who may have knowledge that I don't or experience that I don't, and welcome those kinds of relationships. But when you're taking the pot shots from somebody who isn't even standing in the same, space as you are, that was hard. That was really hard. And it was hard to resist the temptation to want to just counterattack. Really hard. But I'm very grateful, because when I was probably at the worst of it, the Lord really pressed on me the book of Nehemiah. And he just kept saying, just keep building the wall, just keep building the wall, just keep your head down, just keep building the wall. And boy, I'm a fighter spirit. And that was hard because I would have much rather just picked up the sword and had to really fight myself and seek a lot of counsel from my board members, from close friends, and saying, I'm hearing this, that I'm supposed to just keep my head down and keep going. And but then when my impulse to go back and pick up the sword would rear its ugly head, it's good to have friends say, that's not what you've been told to do. So against what I wanted to do when I was going through those really tough seasons of criticism and slanderous talk and things like that, I had to, as it says in Exodus, be still and let the Lord fight for you.
That's great. And so if any of our listeners are going through this right now, are there any words of hope or encouragement we can leave them with?
Well, I think, yes. If one story, Nehemiah helped me. If Jeanne can help you, that's great. I took so much stock in, frankly, Old Testament characters because they just got their butts handed to them on a plate sometimes. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh my goodness. At least my situation isn't as bad as that, right? And so sitting around in that same, Hebrews Hall of Fame and just kind of going, okay, it's not that bad. I have not suffered unto the point of bloodshed, or death. So that that was a comfort to me. I have learned, I hope resolutely now, that when God calls you to something really large, and this problem goes well beyond anything that we can alone solve, certainly independently, that you just have to do the piece that you're called to do, and you have to trust God with the rest of it. And if I'm getting criticism like, well, what are you doing about young children or boys or transgender, and what are you doing about legislation, and what are you doing about this? And just these arrows coming over the fence, of what we're not doing. I had to say, I have to continue to stay centered and keep my staff centered on, but this is the piece we're called to do. And as long as we're just doing the piece of it that we're called to do, we have to turn over the rest of it. And so my encouragement to anybody else is throw your whole heart into the piece that you're called to do, and let everything else, let all the other arrows just fall to the floor, because they're not yours to do. They're not. And you will go off mission, and you will sap your own energy if you try to fight back every single one of them, or the ones that aren't intended for you. Great.
Well, Jeanne, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thanks so much for sharing your words of wisdom and for everything that you're doing to help these women. And to all of our listeners, thank you for everything you do to make the world a better place.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast with Kirsten Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, nonprofitleadersnetwork.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. Join us next time for another edition of the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast.